Our text is on the second page of the bulletin, if you want to follow along there, from the 20th chapter of Luke. It's a significant text for me personally this week because on Monday I completed in World Masterpieces teaching the book of Ecclesiastes, which I believe is the most important book in the Old Testament. I'm the only one of the 7 billion people on this planet who thinks that. But, of course, Ecclesiastes is the book showing if there is no afterlife, what's the point of religion? Is it worth anything? Why, how can you feel good about life if this life is all there is? There aren't enough good things in this life to make up for the pain, according to that writer. And so today, there are a group of Jewish people who think there's a resurrection, a group who think there's not. Jesus is going to attempt to settle that for them, and Willis is going to help. Some of the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus with a question. "Teacher," they said, "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." Now there were 7 brothers. The first one married a woman and died childless. The second and the third married her, and in the same way, the 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died too. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since these 7 were married to her? Jesus replied, "You moron." Oh, I'm sorry, I added that. Jesus replied, "The people of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And they can no longer die, for they are like the angels. They are God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. But in the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise. For he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive." Some of the teachers of the law responded, "Well said, teacher," and no one dared ask him any more questions.
Well, I'm hopeful that at the end of my remarks, you won't dare to ask me any questions either. Yeah, that was implied, not stated, but implied anyway. So this sermon begins with a discussion of marriage. How many of you have seen the movie The Princess Bride? Say it with me. Marriage is what brings us together. I've always wanted to do that. But you can't talk about marriage without talking about divorce. And especially, you can't talk about either thing without statistics. So I brought a few slides this morning. Roger, are you ready with the slides? This one from the CDC, numbers of marriages, marriage rates, divorce rates. Go on to the next one. This is for the visual learners. This is from JesusIsLord.com, and it correlates federal spending and the divorce rate. And one last one, go on. Dr. Phil, a major authority on everything in the world. 59% of marriages for women under the age of 18 and in divorce within 15 years, dropping to 36% for those 20 and older. So, what does all of that have to do with me and my married state or single state if you're single? Simple answer, practically nothing. Right? You can blank those out. Because that's exactly what these guys are doing, right, in the beginning of this text. They're throwing out a whole bunch of really goofy information about all these brothers and how they were married and And it really doesn't have anything to do with the topic that they really are interested in getting to Jesus about, which is the resurrection. They are part of a subgroup of Judaism in which they only accept the first books of the Bible as being authoritative. And so Moses, to them, is the ultimate authority. The books of the law, and especially the tradition is that Moses himself composed those first 5 books. And so for them, this continues, and for Luke, it clearly continues, this question of Jesus and his authority. These guys want to talk to Jesus about the resurrection because they believe it will point out that he is in contradiction with authority, the authority of Moses. And as we learned a little earlier in the chapter, all of the Jewish authorities are specifically at this point, right? Having seen Jesus at work, we've been following with Luke his travels, his teaching, his healing, his bringing of the message of the kingdom of God. They're convinced now that he's dangerous and that he's dangerously wrong, and they want to prove it. And so they've been challenging him with all these questions and trying to find out, is he really an authority? And they, of course, think he's not. And so in the question of the resurrection, they're still trying to trick him and get him and trying to prove to the people that Jesus is wrong. And so, resurrection becomes the framework today for that question. And so, I want to talk about resurrection because Jesus does, but I want us to keep in mind that the bigger picture here and what Luke is framing for us in his gospel account is that we're almost at the very pinnacle of God himself authenticating and proving the authority of Jesus by raising him from the dead. That if you read Paul's letters or the letter to the Hebrews, it's very clear that among all of the Greek world, all of the various Jewish traditions of all the Stoics and Epicureans that Paul will argue with in Acts, and out of all those possible philosophies and questions of who's right, who understands, what is the ultimate authority, that what proves that Jesus is authoritative and is backed by God is that he's raised from the dead. And so this juncture is a key point for Luke because he's talking now about resurrection. And so he does tell us some things about resurrection. And the first point that I want to bring out is that what he tells us is that we know a tiny, tiny, tiny bit about the world to come. That it's hugely different than anything that we can know or imagine. That something as fundamental to the fabric of life in our world. Marriage, the creation of family, the begetting of children, the movement through time by generation after generation, teaching the young how to live into God in the context of marriage, is not a permanent part of the next age. That our understanding of what the new creation will be is very, very limited. And that one of our major tools for understanding anything is to compare and contrast it with our known lives and world. And the first thing that becomes clear here is that he's saying a major part of what you know about your world does not apply to the next. That in this world, in this time, in our frame of understanding, marriage is part of the fabric of that world. And it's very important, it's wonderful, it's good, it's what God has created and intended, but it doesn't tell you how the next world is. And so I think that that's important for us to keep in mind, that it's very easy to get into the same position as these morons in our text and to begin to nitpick about his words. Well, what does it mean that you need to be considered worthy of that? Does that get us into a whole big discussion about works righteousness and the meaning of justification and all kinds of things? Or what does it mean if I'm single already or have been divorced? Or, I mean, all of these amazing questions and debates. And are we supposed to just get in there? And I don't think so. I think that underlying question of the person and authority of Jesus, knowing him, knowing who he is where we need to focus our attention. But he does tell us a few things, very interesting things, I think, that in that next stage, people won't marry and be given in marriage, and they can no longer die. That's another one of those things about life that is so ingrained in our understanding of the way the world works that it's almost impossible. For me, it literally is impossible to consider an endless life, a life that doesn't include an expectation of death. That's always been part of the world that we know. I don't know anybody who was alive during the American Revolution. Any of you have friends, family, know anybody? And that's recent history, right? Julius Caesar, anybody? Death is absolutely part of the fabric of our understanding of this age and this world. And so Jesus tells us something crucially important there about the difference between our whole basis for how we live. Right? The the phrase that comes to my mind is that our whole lives are spent in slavery to the fear of death. So much of what we do is motivated by fear of death, seeking security, seeking protection, seeking safety, afraid of death. And so Jesus offers us here a glimpse into a different kind of life. They no longer die, he says. Not only do they not marry and be given in marriage, but they no longer die. And he says they're like the angels in that they're God's children. There's that wonderful text in John's first letter about what we are already and what we are becoming. And that's exactly that line that Jesus is focusing on here, right? It's being and becoming. We are called the children of God. You remember his letter? He's talked about knowing Jesus personally, that he was his friend. He spoke with him. He handled and touched him. We're just about entering into the Lenten season, and we're almost in Luke's Gospel, remembering that Last Supper, the giving of the elements, and Jesus offering his body and blood. And I think that John was literally reclining against Jesus' side. When you read the accounts of how they were reclining together, and then Jesus talked about someone that's going to betray me, and the disciple was leaning right against him, physically knew and touched him. The physical person of Jesus. And he then writes, it's an amazing and incredible thing that we are now called children of God. But it hasn't been revealed yet what will become. He still knows, and we all still know, that we've only tasted the tiniest bit of what it means to be the children of God. The promise of an endless life, and that life is in fellowship with the living Christ, the resurrected Son of God. And so he ends the little exchange with these ones who are so anxious to be proven right about Moses and what he said, by very cleverly and clearly pointing out that Moses himself knew a living God, and that their shredding of all the tiny details of the law was not about life, was not about that incredible mystery of the I am, saying to Moses, I am that I am the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. Not I was their God while they were alive, but I am their God. And so, I want to read just briefly from the the letter to the Hebrews and to settle, like Marv was suggesting, I'll let the letter settle. Is Jesus more authoritative about the resurrection than the Sadducees? Therefore, holy brothers who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle and high priest whom we confess. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to that which would be said in the future. But Christ is faithful as a son over God's house, and we are his house, if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast. So as we move towards communion, let me read briefly too from John's Gospel, in which Jesus again offers himself, his person, as the answer to all debates about life and death, about resurrection. Stop grumbling among yourselves, Jesus said. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. I think that's amazing. He doesn't give anyone else space in that statement about resurrection. It's Jesus himself saying, I will raise him up at the last day. It is written in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who listens to the Father and learns from him comes to me. No one has seen the Father except the one who is from God. Only he has seen the Father. I tell you the truth, he who believes has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. We do practice open communion at Church of the Savior. Everyone is welcome. I'll serve at this table, and Marv will serve in the back corner. At this table, you can serve yourselves or each other, your friends and family. A group will gather in the back. But before we come, let's take just a few minutes in silence together. As we just heard from John's Gospel, if the Father draws you, who you come to is Jesus, the living Son. And so, don't resist that. If in any way this morning the Father is wanting to draw you